Hello friends, this is Maria Jose Hamel. I was going to do this presentation at the Watsonville Seventh-day Adventist Church, and that presentation got canceled because of the current situation with the coronavirus epidemic. As you probably know, Santa Cruz County, where the church is found, is under shelter-in-place order, and so is Monterey County, where I live. So all the churches have canceled their services. So I wanted to still do this presentation, so I decided to do it in video. I hope it's helpful for you, because what I was going to talk about is evidence-based ways you can boost your immune system, and also talk about some of the home remedies that were used in the past for viral infections that I think are good to know in case of a viral infection like influenza, possibly coronavirus, although we don't know. So keep in mind that coronavirus, this disease by the new novel coronavirus, is called COVID-19. This infection is new, and this virus is new. So we don't know, we don't have evidence-based information about what can and cannot work with this COVID-19. So whenever you hear out in the news, or not in the news, but maybe out in social media about cures or things that kill the virus, take that with a grain of salt, because there's nothing that has been proven to kill the virus. This is a novel virus. We don't know yet what will work and what won't. But we do know, and in fact I wanted to show you a chart about this, there are very few diseases in history that have a 100% mortality. Meaning that for most diseases, people who get it, there's people who get it and who do not die of them. Even highly infectious diseases like Ebola has, depending on the type, could have a mortality rate between 60 and 90%. In other words, there's still people who get it but don't die. Even untreated HIV has a death rate of maybe around 90%. So that means there's people who will survive it. Now, these are highly fatal diseases, so there's not that. They're very infectious and very dangerous diseases. But the point is, most other diseases are not as dangerous, have a lower fatality rate, meaning people do survive. Some people do survive these infections. With the coronavirus, we know that about 80% of the people who get infected only have a mild infection. And then, of course, there's 20% who get a severe infection. Of those, about 5% are critical condition, and about 1% need respirators. And of course, some people do die of this disease, as we know. So what makes the difference between people who die or people who get a serious infection and people who don't? And what we know is that in most cases, what actually makes the difference is the immune system. And we know this because they've told us this. People who are immunocompromised, in other words, who have lowered immune system because of different diseases, are at a higher risk for serious infection. People who have underlying conditions such as diabetes, such as high blood pressure especially, are at a higher risk for a serious infection. So we know that these people are at higher risk because their immune systems are compromised. So today I want to talk about 8 ways to strengthen your immune system. In the next video, I'm going to talk about the natural remedies or home remedies that were used in the past for viral infections. I'm not going to put them in this video because it's going to make it too long. I'm going to try to hurry up. But in today's video, I'm going to talk about boosting your immune system and 8 steps that are evidence-based. These are not cures that some doctor or somebody on TV or somebody on the internet talked about. I'm going to show you the research, so you know for sure that everything I'm going to present to you is based on solid evidence. So that's something that we need to keep in mind, that in the era of coronavirus, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and try to keep your feet grounded on solid science. So that's what I'm going to show you today. So let's get started. Step number 1 for boosting your immune system is the diet. If you know me personally, you know that I promote a whole food plant-based diet because it helps to reverse diseases such as diabetes and high blood pressure and heart disease and others. But can diet actually help us with our immune system? Well, I'll show you some research. First of all, I want to show you this particular study that talks about the function of a particular type of immune cell called natural killer cell, and how it was found that people who consume a vegetarian diet actually have higher activity of these natural killer cells than people who eat an omnivorous diet. So you see there in the two charts, there is a comparison between the blood lymphocytes and of the vegetarians and omnivores and the natural killer cell activity of the blood lymphocytes. And you see that there's a higher function of these cells in vegetarians than in omnivores. So that's number one. Number two, here's a study that talks about fruits and vegetables and the intake of these and the risk of upper respiratory tract infection. Now, this study was done in pregnant women, but if you generalize, you can probably generalize it because we know that, I'll show you other studies that talk about the benefits of fruits and vegetables. So this particular one was done with pregnant women, and the conclusion there says women who consume more fruits and vegetables have moderate reduction of risk of upper respiratory tract infection during pregnancy. And this benefit appears to be derived from both fruits and vegetables combined as opposed to either one alone. So fruits and vegetables, very important. And of course, a whole food plant-based diet is high in fruits and vegetables. I just wanted to show you the table where they show the different quartiles, meaning first quartile, lowest intake, fourth quartile, the highest intake of fruits and vegetables. And you see there about a 39% reduction in the risk for upper respiratory tract infection. So important to consume a lot of fruits and vegetables. This study talks about micro and macronutrients and the lack of them. So when macronutrients are the big ones, are protein, carbohydrates, and fats that give us calories. When we're low in those means we're starving. So of course, if we're starving, our immune system is going to be affected. But what about the micronutrients? Those are the vitamins, minerals, phytochemicals, and antioxidants that could be low even when we're obese. If we consume a high processed food diet, we can be consuming a lot of calories and very few micronutrients. In other words, we could lack micronutrients, but not necessarily be starving. And when we consume very few micronutrients, in other words, when we have micronutrient deficiency, that can compromise our immune system, as it shows right here in this study. Next one talks about the antiviral activity of phytochemicals. Phytochemicals, the word phyto means plant. So phytochemicals are only found in, guess what? Plants. Not in animal foods, only in plant foods, but only in plant foods that are not processed, because the processing takes away the phytonutrients, as you probably know. So it talks right here about all kinds of different phytonutrients, or phytochemicals. I'm not going to list them. There's a lot of them, as you can see: flavonoids, terpenoids, organosulfur compounds, etc., etc. It lists a bunch. And then it says that they actually have therapeutic applications against different genetically and functionally diverse viruses. The antiviral mechanism of these agents may be explained on basis of their antioxidant activities, scavenging capacities, inhibiting DNA and RNA synthesis, inhibition of viral entry, or inhibition of the viral reproduction. In other words, there's several ways in which these phytochemicals, these nutrients only found in plants, that are antiviral. So that's great. Great news. Here's another important study. This talks about fat, and it shows us that there's an increase in the activity of a certain type of an immune system called natural killer cells. The activity of these cells goes up as the amount of fat in the diet goes down. And this particular effect was more significant for people who consumed a diet that was higher than 25% fat. And I can tell you right now, the average American diet is about 40% fat. Probably, maybe sometimes lower, 38 to 40% fat. So we consume a very high fat diet in the United States. So this is highly significant for just about everybody in the United States. Just FYI. So we already saw the different aspects of a whole food plant-based diet and how research has shown that all these different aspects of the whole food plant-based diet help when it comes to immunity. Now I want to talk about sugar in particular. A whole food plant-based diet should not have any sugar because sugar is not a whole food. But sugar in particular has been shown to affect the immune system. And here is a study from a long time ago that had shown decades ago that when we consume simple carbohydrates in the form of sugar, it causes a decrease in the phagocytic index. In other words, the ability of our immune system cells to engulf and destroy viruses and bacteria. So this study shows right here that there is a decrease in the ability of our immune system cells to do that, and the greatest effect was observed between 1 to 2 hours after consuming the sugar, but this effect actually lasted about 5 hours after feeding. In other words, it's a long-lasting effect, and it can last from one meal to the next meal if we're consuming sugar in both meals. And it shows clearly that the immune function is affected by sugar and can last for hours. So I would say one of the most important aspects about avoiding, lowering the ability of our immune system to fight infections is to avoid sugar completely. And so now we've seen all the different aspects of a whole food plant-based diet. And that's why I believe the best diet to keep away from infections and infectious diseases is a whole food plant-based diet. That was step number 1. I'll go straight to step number 2. Step number 2 for increasing or boosting your immune system is physical activity. And I'm not going to go through several different studies because here I found a great review. And a review basically takes several studies and puts the information together. And what I like about this review is that it gives us the highlights, right? Right there you can see on the screen. Acute exercise is an immune system adjuvant that improves defense, activity, and metabolic health. That's the bullet point number 1. Bullet point number 2 says data supports a clear inverse relationship between moderate exercise training and illness risk. In other words, the the higher amount of moderate exercise, the lower the risk for illness. It also says that exercise is anti-inflammatory. They're in the third bullet point. It does say that illness risk is increased in athletes or in periods of intensified training. So in other words, people who do run like marathons, do a lot of very high intensity exercise, sometimes their immune system is lower. So that's why when I talk about exercise, I talk about moderate exercise as opposed to running marathons, because running marathons actually is a little bit too much stress for the body. But it then talks about carbohydrate and how carbohydrate helps for exercise activity, because we know carbohydrates are the main fuel of the body. So that's important to keep in mind. That we want to eat the good types of carbohydrate, not sugar, but not processed carbohydrates. And then habitual exercise improves immune regulation, delaying the onset of age-related dysfunction. So this is very important to keep in mind as we age, that our immune system actually gets lowered with age, but exercise helps to keep us young in that sense. So that's step number 2. Step number 3 for keeping our immune system healthy is sleep. And I just wanted to show you another review in regards to sleep and the immune function. And it talks about a certain type of immune cell called the T cells, and how actually when we skip on what they call here early nocturnal sleep, we actually affect our immune system, because that part of the sleep is actually when the growth hormone is produced. During early nocturnal sleep is when we have what's called the slow wave sleep. And if we skip on that, we actually are not producing as much growth hormone, which actually impairs our immune system. So there's a lot of detail here, so I'm not going to go into it a lot, but just wanted to let you know that it's not only not getting enough sleep, but also at what time we go to bed that affects our immunity. And if we go to bed too late, we skip on that slow wave sleep, which actually can be detrimental for immune system. There's another article here. It's a research letter called titled "Association of Insufficient Sleep with Respiratory Infection Among Adults in the United States," and it basically shows that when we have sleep loss, it can adversely affect components of the immune system critical for host resistance to infectious illnesses. And short sleep duration and sleep disturbances prospectively predict increased susceptibility to upper respiratory infection. And in the result part of this study, it shows that when we sleep very, very little, like less than 5 hours, this is particularly bad for our immune system, because it showed in their study that people had a higher likelihood to report a head or chest cold or an infection if they slept less than 5 hours. And similarly, people who have sleep disorders or disclosed trouble sleeping to a physician were also more likely to have a head or a chest cold and an infection. So it's very important to get enough sleep. So here's two aspects of sleep: enough hours of sleep and at what time we go to bed. There's two important aspects of sleep that have to do with our immune system. That was step number 3. Step number 4, avoid dehydration. Here's another review that talks about hydration in general with health, and it's a pretty long article. If you wanted to read it, I will give you I give you here the title. You can look it up, but also if you want, I can give you the reference. But there's a section of it that talks about the immune function and viral illnesses in particular. And it talks about how when we are in a hypohydrated state, in other words, a state of dehydration, it affects the function of some of our immune cells. And there's a lot of details here too, but basically there's alterations in our immune system that have to do with inflammatory responses in our body and lower our immunity as well. So it's very important to keep hydrated. That's step number 4. Step number 5 is to avoid stress. And there's so much research on this. It's really hard to just condense it. So I just wanted to show you this graphic that kind of gives us an idea of how complex the relationship between stress and the immune system. And there's actually a table kind of summarizes some of the factors that are stressful in our lives, interpersonal factors that have to do with stress and how they affect the immune system. As you can see, it's pretty complex. So if you want the details, you can look it up. But basically, just to give you a summary of this, it says that certain factors can prolong or exacerbate the effects of stress. So different types of really negative thinking or negative emotions can really affect our level of stress, which in turn leads to lower immunity. But at the same time, there are good things. There are good aspects of our emotional response to stressful events that can actually do the opposite. So it all has to do with how we cope with stressful events in our lives. And I think some of you who are Christian and some of you who are from Church and Adventist, really, I think as Christians need to keep in mind that we do have like an important way to cope with stress if we are believers, because we have something to believe in, we have something to hold on to if we are going through tough times. And right now, with the COVID-19 epidemic, this is stressful, but we have faith and we have a hope that things will be better. So I think it's important in times of stress to really use our faith and belief to cope with stressful times. So, and of course, if you're a believer or not, we really should find ways to cope with stress, manage stress. Some of the things that help that I know, for instance, are deep breathing and using relaxation techniques and things like that. So stressful events, we need to learn how to cope with them. So that's step number 5. Step number 6 is avoid addictive substances. And of course, this is so obvious. I'm going to go over them pretty quickly because I don't think I need to convince you that addictive substances such as tobacco and alcohol are bad. But maybe I do, especially when it comes to alcohol. Some people nowadays think that moderate amounts of alcohol are actually beneficial to to health. So now we know, of course, from later studies, more recent studies, that even moderate amounts of alcohol can be detrimental because they increase the risk for cancer. But I'm not going to talk about cancer. I'm just going to talk about in terms of immunity. And this review talks about the consequences of alcohol consumption on host defense. And it talks about, again, a certain type of immune cell called, in this case, the T lymphocyte, and how alcohol consumption directly affects the function of T lymphocytes. Decreased antigen-presenting cell function appears to be a key element in the ethanol-induced decrease in cell-mediated immunity. In other words, when we consume alcohol, this type of immunity goes down. And down at the bottom says functional abnormalities of T and B lymphocytes, natural killer cells, and monocytes of macrophages, resulting in the altered immune response seen after alcohol use. So there's more science on this. I just wanted to show you an example. Here's a study that talks about cigarette smoke. And again, I don't think I need to convince you. We all know how bad cigarette smoking is and has an ability to suppress the immune system, as you see there. And over here, it talks about chronic inhalation of cigarette smoke alters a wide range of immunological functions, including innate and adaptive immune responses. It has been speculated that many of the health consequences of chronic inhalation of cigarette smoke might be due to its adverse effects on the immune system. So many people who are smokers are like, well, okay, I'm going to change to vaping instead because it's healthier or less harmful. Well, there are some research studies done on vaping. And here's one, for instance, that talks about the pro-inflammatory effects of electronic cigarette vapor condensate on human alveolar macrophages. And alveolar macrophages are the immune cells in the lungs that help to protect the lungs from infections. And we see that vaping actually significantly inhibited phagocytosis, in other words, the ability of these cells to engulf and consume and destroy these pathogens. And right there at the bottom line, it says vaporized e-cigarette fluid is cytotoxic. Cytotoxic means it's toxic to the cells. And it's pro-inflammatory, and it inhibits phagocytosis in alveolar macrophages. So again, it's not free from harmful effects. Here's something else that I think is pretty obvious. I just wanted to go over it pretty quickly just in case. I don't think it'll be any surprise to you to know that drugs of abuse are also of course, have a negative effect on the immune system. So things such as opiates, and you can see right there in table 1 of this study called Microbial Infections and Immunomodulation and Drugs of Abuse, and how in table 1 the opiates have all kinds of different effects on immune response in the human body as well as in animals. They've done all kinds of different studies on this. This next table talks about THC, which is the main component of cannabis, as you probably know. So both in vivo and in vitro, in other words, in a lab and in animals and in humans, we show that there's all kinds of negative effects on the immune system from cannabis. Here's another table on the effects of cocaine. I don't think it will surprise anybody to know that cocaine is bad for your immune system. So of course, staying away from drugs is good. And it's also good for your immune system. But let me just say that we talked about sugar, and sugar is addictive too, so you can put it in this step too if you wanted to, because I think sugar is a drug. But anyway, that's besides the point. Okay, we're coming to the end. Step number 7 is moderate sunlight. And moderate sunlight, well, I mean, some people might be worried about sunlight and thinking that maybe exposing their skin to sunlight could cause skin cancer. But we're not talking about excessive sunlight. We're not talking about the type of, exposure that would give you a sunburn. We're talking about moderate sunlight exposure. And we know that is actually beneficial because, first of all, we know that it actually helps to produce vitamin D, which is very important for our body. But This, for instance, this article right here talks about how sunlight is associated with positive health outcomes, including reduced incidences of autoimmune diseases and cancer. So that has to do with your immune system, both cancer and autoimmune diseases. And it says that T lymphocytes possess intrinsic photosensitivity. So these types of cells are actually very sensitive to sunlight touching our skin and actually become activated in the skin once the skin touches this, or there's exposure on the skin to sunlight. This other research article talks about sunlight on the influenza virus in particular, and it has been shown that sunlight can actually deactivate the influenza virus and actually lower the transmission of influenza. And actually you can see in the highlighted area right there how the half-life of the influenza virus is dramatically cut with exposure to sunlight. It goes from 31.6 minutes, the half-life in darkness of the influenza virus, to being 2.4 minutes. So it dies quicker in the presence of sunlight. And the last step to boost your immune system is to avoid pollution, because air pollution is pretty bad. For instance, right here, there's a study that talks about pollution and how it affects the function of regulatory T cells for people who have asthma. So that's pretty self-explanatory. People who have asthma really do bad in air pollution. Also, effects of air pollutants on innate immunity, and this is quite a long also research study that shows how it affects our innate immunity. So it's important to stay away from air pollutants. And this is very interesting right here. This last study I want to show you is how historically both sunlight, which I just talked in the last step, and fresh air or natural ventilations were used to control infections in the past. This is way before antibiotics were created and before we had like vaccines and stuff like that. So for instance, back in the day, hospitals were created to have like big windows, and they're allowed the air to flow, and also south facing so that there's enough sunlight coming in. And so because there was actually evidence that both sunlight and natural fresh air actually they help protect from transmission of airborne pathogens. We know sunlight boosts resistance to infection, and older studies suggested potential roles for surface decontamination. Sunlight actually kills pathogens on surfaces. And it's too bad, says right here in this article from the Journal of Hospital Infections, it's too bad that modern practices of designing healthcare buildings are more geared toward comfort that favor pathogen persistence. In other words, today our hospitals are not designed to kill pathogens inside the hospitals like they used to be, because this basically changed in the 1950s when we had antibiotics, and we thought, oh, now we've solved the problems of pathogens forever. Well, that didn't work out too well, and especially now that we have a lot of, like I said before, pathogens that are actually antibiotic resistant. So I think it's important to keep this in mind, but I will talk about this more in depth in the next video when I talk about the remedies that were used in the past to actually overcome viral infections, or at least recover from them quicker, and how we can still use these today for things such as the novel coronavirus, for which we have no vaccination, and at least right now, as of March of 2020, we have no vaccination for it. We have no therapeutics for it, although there might be some coming up soon, hopefully. But even then, we still don't know how effective it will be. We'll have to see how effective these therapies are. But even if they are effective, we also have this other option in case we don't have any insurance or we don't have access to these. It's good to know what things have worked in the past. So that will be the next video. I don't want to make this one too long, and I also don't have a very big memory card in my camera, so that's why I have to make shorter videos. But I hope to see you in the next video. I hope you maybe can, I don't know, go to my channel and subscribe. I'm not a YouTuber, so I don't know how this works. But I think if you subscribe and you turn on your notifications, you will be notified when the next video is up. So I hope this gives you some good information on how to prevent infectious diseases, and to know that yes, you can boost your immune system. Your immune system is what keeps you alive and is what keeps you healthy in case of infection. So I hope this gives you good information for you to use, and hope to see you in the next video. Stay well.